5 strategies to inflation-proof your retirement. Analyze your budget and spending. So one of the things, Yelisey, that you and I see all the time is people come in and they lay out their fixed expenses and they'll say, hey, our expenses are $4,000 a month. And I'll say, well, let's test that. Dave Ramsey has something called zero net budgeting. And we'll say between the two of you, you're bringing in $8,000 a month. So I'll say, so you guys live on $4,000 a month and you're saving $4,000 a month in checking, savings, brokerage accounts. And they look at each other and they look at me and they go, no, we're saving in the 401k or the IRA, but we're not saving after we get paid. So one of the things that we see is a lot of people underestimate their variable expenses. What I'll hear people say is, we did spend all of it this year, but this year we replaced the roof. Hey, we did spend all of it this year, but this year we bought a vehicle and we don't do that every year. We did do that this year, but this year we helped our kids with some school loans. We don't do that every year. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is most people have variable expenses every month, every year, and you have to plan for those. A lot of the people that we meet with, they'll use a planning tool and they'll play around with the planning tool based on their fixed expenses, not their living expenses. So number one is analyze your budget and your spending. The best way to start is look at your last 12 to 24 months and look to see what went out. And I would say, don't make excuses why it's not going to happen again, because it's probably going to happen again. Some of those big variable expenses are travel, eating out, the amount of money you spend on gas, gifts, for things, whether it's birthday presents, Christmas presents, home improvement, things on your vehicle. Make sure that you are planning for those variable expenses. And when you do your projections, Yelisey, this, we meet with people all the time. It doesn't matter if they have $500,000 or $1 million in retirement. A lot of people are $500 to $700 a month away from either being positioned well in retirement or running short on assets. So Don't underestimate the importance of analyzing your budget and your current annual spending.
And I love that you said $500 to $700 away from having a successful plan. One of the things I did in preparation for this conversation was obviously I didn't grab like a giant sample size, but I just went through like 15, 20 of our clients and I just said, hey, like what are people spending on average, clients that I know well? And the number that I kind of came up with, at least this was a few years ago, was they're spending about $7,000 a month. And I know we have some people that spend 3 times that per month and some people who spend way less than that. But I think like it just was a good figure. A lot of retirees that we work with, I could probably pretty confidently say that maybe $7,000 a month represents a good average, right? Well, so in 2020, if you were looking, 3 or 4 years ago, that's about $84,000 a year. And if inflation is up roughly 22% cumulatively, today that would be about $8,300 a month. So if you spent $7,000 back then, today you're spending about $8,300 or $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
We're talking about $1,000 difference. So you're saying if people could just do a little bit of planning and they could add $500 to $700 a month, that could be the difference between making it and not making it in retirement. If we just look at, the last 3 years, that's forcing people on average to spend an extra $1,000 if you fall kind of within that average that I mentioned. Like, that's a big deal. Like, if you were to sit down with your financial advisor today and just said, hey, why don't you add $1,000 to my monthly budget? Like, I can tell you just by, looking through this recently, if every person did that, if every one of our clients did that, there'd be a handful of people that wouldn't make it, like that their funds wouldn't last to an age that they're comfortable with, right? Adding $1,000 a month, that makes a big difference. So inflation does play a big role in that. And I think that whether you're talking about cutting expenses or analyzing your expenses, having a realistic conversation on how you spend your money and being precise with that, and just realizing the impact of an additional $1,000, or as Trey mentioned, $500 to $700, like that makes a big difference.
Hey, number 2, think about downsizing or relocating. Now, even though I say this, one of the things I would say is more and more of our retirees are moving to smaller homes or cities. Like I met with a couple yesterday, and they said, hey, we're planning on moving from the Lakeville area down to Farmington because things are just less expensive. And one of the things I will say is there are times where it makes sense to downsize. If you've got a 5-bedroom house and you're looking at downsizing, yes, of course, it's less expensive to take care of a home. that's 1,800 square feet than one that's 5,000. Obvious. One of the things that you and I have found, though, is with interest rates and with a lot of these new townhomes, is we've run into a ton of people. They downsize their home specifically to save on expenses, and they're spending the same amount or more because of interest rates, or even if they pay cash, that townhome that had a $200 HOA 4 years ago is now $450. So one of the things I would tell people is consider downsizing, but don't just downsize to downsize. Count the costs, look at the variables, because if you're going to pay the same and you're going to cut your square footage in half, or maybe you're now in a townhome in a smaller city where the property values don't go up at the same rate, it may be worth staying in your home. So I'm kind of arguing two sides of the coin. But the biggest thing I would say is don't downsize just because you assume that less square footage lowers your cost. Look at all the variables. If you have to borrow money, look at interest rates compared to that, 1.8 or 2.2% or 2.5% that you got during the COVID period, and look to say, are we moving because we just want simpler living, or because we're trying to make a good financial decision? And what I don't want you to do is take on the cost of moving and end up finding out that you moved to a spot that has a greater HOA or additional cost. And we see that.
Yeah. I think it sounds like a good idea to most people. Like, hey, let's downsize, right? We don't need the additional space. But I feel like as many people who've come through here, who've done that, people who've asked for advice on that, I feel like so many people just get it wrong and they don't do it correctly. They don't actually end up having a real net improvement in terms of actually lowering their expenses the way that they thought they would. In fact, when you consider the cost of a mortgage today compared to what they probably have on their existing home, some of that just totally gets offset by the interest rate. We all talk about diversification and the importance of diversification. And one of the things that, is difficult to measure, especially, we had somebody who just came in the other day and mostly, I think 70 or 80% of their portfolio was large cap US stocks. And he wanted to compare performance. And one of the things that, that made the conversation actually productive was the fact that, his portfolio outperformed a lot of diversified portfolios. If you look at the last couple of years, but when we looked at 2022, he also took a much bigger hit back then. And one of the things that I did was I plugged in all of his ticker symbols, as we always do, and then compared it to one of our portfolios. And one of the things that actually made the conversation productive is, we ended up talking about the standard deviation of his portfolio, which for most people, they don't want to look at risk measures like standard deviation and a million other risk measures. That's just outside of what most of the conversations end up going like. But for him, his standard deviation was twice that of ours, which basically means that the volatility in his portfolio, 68% of the time, it was going to be in a much larger range than what he was comfortable with. And I say mostly his wife was comfortable with. So thankfully, it's not just you. If you're married, you have to consider your spouse, you have to consider their preferences and how they might feel about the risk in your portfolio. And for them, that actually ended up being a great conversation. And I think that overall, whether he works with us or he does something on his own or with somebody else, he plans to add more diversification into his portfolio. Even though if you just look at the last couple of years, the categories that represent his portfolio currently have outperformed a well-diversified portfolio. Over time, you don't have such large fluctuations within your portfolio. And over time, you have stable and consistent returns, which I think for retirees probably matter more than, trying to hit a home run, but also, striking out every once in a while. That stability ends up having, I think overall, a larger or a better average rate of return over time.
Number 4, invest in stocks. So allocating a portion of your retirement funds to high quality dividend paying stocks or stock mutual funds. You kind of touched on this, but one of the things I'd say is, what's funny is we will have two groups of people come in. We have people that come in that we go, hey man, you're still at 90% stock and you're going to be drawing on these assets. We need to talk about some preservation. But we also, we really don't talk a lot about this, Yelisey, and I actually think it's important. We also run into people, maybe 5 to 7% of the time that I go, hey, we normally are talking people down from high levels of risk based on, being in retirement or preparing for retirement. But there's couples that I meet with that we have to talk them in to taking some risk.
Yeah.
Because something scared them during COVID, or something scared them when Biden got in. Now someone's scared when Trump is in. And so one of the things that we see is we see people that'll make what I would say is an emotional decision. And I'm not picking on that because, I'm not near retirement, so I can't say how I would respond, because we are all more emotional with their own money. But one of the things that we see people make a mistake is they pull out, they go to cash, and now before they know it, they've been sitting in cash for 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, and they've missed out on incredible returns because they weren't in the market. So one of the things I would say to some of you is, if you've gotten out of the market, let's have a conversation. Come sit in my office. Let's talk about what it looks like to get in a way that's comfortable or as close to comfortable as possible. But we want to make sure that your money's not getting eaten up by inflation because you're sitting in a CD or a money market and now you're seeing those rates start to drop, which can be a problem for a lot of the people that we meet.